welcome to all of our listeners and viewers in Asia, in America, wherever you are in the world. I'm Rana Foroohar. I'm the global economic columnist for the Financial Times. I'm also an economic analyst for CNN, and I am delighted to be here with Fareed Zakaria, who is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN International. And he is also a columnist for the Washington Post and author of many books and a very interesting and timely new book called 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. So welcome, Fareed. Delighted to be in conversation with you as always.
Pleasure for me as well, Rana, and welcome and hi to everyone wherever you are, whatever the time zone is.
So we have about 45 minutes, and we're going to discuss the state of the post-pandemic world, what might be coming up in the next year in Asia and elsewhere. And so before I jump into the many really interesting lessons in your book and the history, which is fascinating, let me ask you, just going forward now into what is, I guess, in some parts of the world anyway, a third wave of the virus, potential lockdowns, maybe more economic recessions and downturns. What worries you most and what doesn't in terms of regions, issues? Maybe you can speak a bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rana. It's and you're quite right to think about it in terms of regions and issues. Big picture, I think what we realize is this is a real pandemic because this virus has turned out to have that kind of sweet spot quality, which is that it is pretty transmissible, in fact, very transmissible, but not super lethal. So if you think about a virus is trying to, if you think about a virus, its urge to survive. It should not kill too quickly and too easily because then it kills the host and it can't spread. It cannot kill so little that it's not lethal, So Ebola, for example, terribly lethal virus, but of course it couldn't spread because it was killing its host, the human host, too rapidly.
Yeah.
COVID-19 turns out to be, or the novel coronavirus turns out to be the perfect sweet spot. It spreads easily, it kills a fair amount, but it doesn't kill a huge amount. So this is the pandemic we've worried about, and it looks like it's going to be hard to contain. You can see this in the waves. You can see it in the fact that other than a few small countries in East Asia, and we can get back to that, and China, almost nobody has been able to contain it. The good news is the first half of this crisis, which we have gone through right now, has been largely about the public health response to it, which has been by and large poor with the exception of the East Asian countries. The second half of this crisis is going to be the private sector's response to it, which is treatments and vaccines. There, I predict that the West will overperform just as it underperformed in the first part of it. So I think there is good news to come. I think you're going to find treatments that are more dramatically, that work better than people realize. We will all become like President Trump. We will have access to extraordinary drugs. I hope they don't have the same effect on us that they have on him. But we will then have vaccines, and there will be many of varying quality, but there will be many. So to me, and then the final point I'd make is the greatest puzzle of this virus, without any question, is why there are parts of Asia and Africa where the death rates are really stunningly low. If you look at countries like Pakistan, which really have not done much to try to deal with the vaccine, they've essentially just taken the attitude of a kind of fatalistic attitude. The death rates are very low. All the predictions of the kind of massive explosion of death that was going to take place in places like India, Africa, you haven't really seen that. Who knows why? Probably my own hypothesis is that the populations in these countries are very young and have not been exposed to as much antibiotic and vaccine and things like that, and so have natural immunities and defenses that are quite strong. That is good news, but I think that for countries like Malaysia and countries in Southeast Asia, it should also be a warning. You got lucky with this one. The next one might not have that quality, and people may not, in any particular part of the world may not have the immunities. The key lesson of my book is we have to recognize this has now become an endemic feature of our lives because human development is creating conditions where these kinds of natural backlashes, disasters, epidemics, call them what you will, are much more likely. And so we have to get ready.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, you've touched on many things that I want to tease apart. One point you're making about how a lot of the Asian countries did better on the public health side, and you've even, we've talked, and you've said that you think maybe going forward, China, with its combination of command control, but also access to data, might end up having the best public health system in the world at some point. Meanwhile, you still do have innovation in the US. You've got, and Europe, you've got, the vaccines are coming, but there's a real unequal spread there. Focus on good public health systems versus focus on get a great vaccine, but then who gets it, which sort of, and how fast do we get it? And how capable are we of with our supply chains, getting it out to the public? So this all starts to bring up issues of inequality that have really, it's like a scrim that's been pulled up by COVID. So how do you see all that going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you've written a lot about this with regard to technology and finance, and the degrees to which capitalism is getting kind of distorted in ways that exacerbate these inequalities, right? So if you think about probably the single biggest negative effect that I worry about that is coming out of this pandemic is the exacerbation of inequality everywhere. So take global inequality to begin with, right? One of the great good news stories of the world over the last 30 years has been the reduction of global inequality as people in India and China have risen out of extreme poverty. Well, World Bank now estimates that of the 500 million who escaped extreme poverty over the last 30 years, 100 million will go back into extreme poverty this year alone, probably something like that number next year, unless we have an economic miracle. So that's at the most macro level. Think about it at the level of every society. People like us, Rana, are able to do our jobs fine. I mean, it's a little awkward, it's inconvenient. It would be nicer to be doing this with you in person and to be with our audience in person, but we can all function. But anyone who is in anyone working in a restaurant, a hotel, in retail, on a cruise ship, in a theme park, for them, this is the Great Depression. Then take companies. And again, this is something you've written about really smartly in the book on technology. My book is itself an illustration of one of the themes of my book. So book publishing has actually benefited from COVID-19. Believe it or not, book sales are up because it turns out not everyone is watching TV. There are a few hardy souls who are reading more.
Only so much Netflix you can consume.
Exactly. But whereas Amazon was 30% of the US book sales market in February before COVID, it is now something close to 65%.
Wow.
Now, who has gotten destroyed in that? All the independent bookstores, all the mom and pops. And that phenomenon, of course, is not just true of Amazon. It's true for probably hardware stores where Home Depot has taken over. It's probably true for a whole bunch of other kinds of stores where Walmart has taken over. And this phenomenon is taking place everywhere. I guarantee you it's happening in Malaysia. I know it's happening in India. It's happening in China as well. So the firms that are large, diversified, digital, and have strong lines of credit and big brand names are doing well. The smaller chains are doing poorly. The independent mom and pops are doing badly. So you put all that together and you have a dramatic increase in inequality at every level. And I think we are going to watch this phenomenon of the rise of inequality for the next generation. And it is going to have political effects that we cannot fully understand yet.
Boy, yes, I completely agree with you. And it's interesting because all the changes that we knew were coming to this digital world, to more disruption higher up the economic food chain. I mean, we're fine, but there will still be a number of white collar jobs that will become harder to do. All that's gotten crunched. So what might have taken 15 years is now going to take, 2 to 5 years. What do you think is the best policy prescription for dealing with this? There are some obviously in the US that are hoping for more fiscal stimulus, whether that's possible or not, who knows. Asian countries, China has been pretty good, I think, about dealing with the aftermath. should there be some kind of Schumpeterian, creative destruction here, and we're just going to have a big change? Or do we need to start bailing out more businesses and paying more attention to small businesses in particular?
Yeah, it's a very tough question to answer fully. I don't think anyone has got it completely right. When you look at what China has done, and you and Ruchir Sharma have written a lot about this, it's not clear that much of what they have done has worked, in the sense that they've poured a lot of money into the old state-owned enterprises, into local governments. Those have propped up inefficient businesses. They've maintained employment, but at a very high cost. In order, the cost of maintaining those jobs has gotten higher and higher. They've done some very smart stuff with regard to domestic stimulus, in the consumer stimulus, giving vouchers to people to spend money. I guess my general view, Rana, has always been, and I'd like to know what you think about this. My general view has been, and I write about this in the book, you want to take advantage of the dynamism of this age of technological innovation. You want to take advantage of the extraordinary opportunities of having a global market in capital, services, goods, everything. But you want to give your population all the armament that they need to withstand the incredible pace of change that results. So, they need not just education and universal health care, but great retraining programs, so that every time they lose a job, they can seamlessly move, or at least as seamlessly as possible, move into a different job or industry, depending on what the requirements are at the moment. You need things like unemployment insurance that are quite substantial and easy to get. I think more important than the generosity of the program, if you look at COVID, the countries that have done well, like Germany and Canada, it has been the ease with which those subsidies exist. So it doesn't turn into one of these games that, again, only the rich and the well-connected and the big firms know how to do, and the small ones don't know how to do. So
well, in that in the US, there's been, I think some of the bailout programs here have actually increased cynicism amongst the general population about how government works, because you saw so many big companies jumping the queue. But I'm sorry, please finish.
No. That's a very important point, because I think that, if you look at the Obama stimulus of 08 and 09, there were almost no such worries. There was almost no, kind of misallocation, corruption. Why? It's not that they were so great. It's that they designed it very smartly. A third of it was tax cuts. A third of it was aid to local governments. And only a third of it was these projects, where there were a few, cases where the money may not have been properly allocated. But in this case, what it tells you is the more complicated the subsidies and the legislation, the more likelihood there will be of essentially gaming it and corruption. So my fantasy is that you have, it's sort of the Danish model, which I describe in the book, which is you're very open to the world. You're actually very capitalist, but then you tax a lot, because you need a lot of resources to create equality of opportunity, to create the kind of security and stability that can surround a person so that he can face this world, feeling like he or she is armed for battle.
Yeah. Well, look, I completely agree. And, the point that you make in your book about the quality of government rather than the size seems very important. Of course, in many Western liberal democracies, the quality of the government hasn't been so great in recent years. There are a couple of standout countries, Denmark, Germany, that you mentioned. It's interesting to me because I think a lot of the fixes, a lot of the things that need to underpin the social safety net, education, broadband access in rural areas, infrastructure programs, they could be very easily linked into the biggest challenge of the day, which is climate change. And each of the major regions of the world, China, Europe, the US, perhaps under Biden, have a plan as to how to go forward with decarbonization. We want to make that leap. We know that that's the sort of big new thing that could potentially create shared productivity and jobs growth. But how do we get there? This is one of these tragedy of the commons problems where there's an obvious fix, everyone knows what it is, and we can't seem to get there. How do you see that going forward?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is the great opportunity. And it is exactly as you say, a tragedy of the commons, which means it's in everyone's collective benefit. but no one's individual interest. Nobody, everybody wants to free ride and take advantage of a common benefit without actually having to pay for it. Now, I think that is exactly the moment for leadership. This is the only way you get through these periods is when you have genuine leadership. And the United States used to provide that leadership for the world, of organizing the world, setting an agenda. The biggest challenge we have faced in climate change, other than the scientific reality of it, is that on this issue, the United States has not been able to lead. And it goes well before Donald Trump. It goes all the way back to, Al Gore and Bill Clinton trying to raise these issues, getting nowhere with the Republican Senate, unable to get anything done at Rio, unable to get, the Senate to agree even then. So because of that, and this may be when historians write the story of the kind of decline of American global leadership, this might be the canary in the coal mine. This is the first time when you saw a huge common problem that faced the world, and the United States actually in the back seat, not the front seat. The challenge here is to organize everybody around it. As you say, the solutions are obvious. And again, back to that point about the quality of government being important. The key is to come up with a simple solution. My feeling is if we end up with 100 different subsidy programs, which will all get gamed and corrupted because everyone will be actually funding their favorite industries rather than the ones that need to be done, we're in for disaster. The much simpler thing to do would be to do things like simple, strong market signals, like a price on carbon, a tax on carbon, and then very simple tax credits for anything that is carbon neutral or has zero emissions. You don't pick what it is, but as that's government works well when there is the simplicity, so it cannot be gamed. And that's something, if you look at how Singapore works, even though people often think of it as a nanny state, they're often very clever in policies that are very simple and difficult to game, difficult to corrupt. They don't rely on the genius of their bureaucracy, even though they have a very efficient one. They rely on the simplicity of rules.
That's a really interesting point. Just I was in Pennsylvania talking to some union workers, coal miners, and they were saying, we understand that ultimately we're going to move away from coal, we're going to move towards wind, solar. But from our perspective, these jobs still pay 40% above the median wage in the US. Meanwhile, clean tech jobs tend to be non-unionized. They pay a couple dollars more than the average US wage. Why is that? Well, interestingly, some of the well-governed Scandinavian countries that are the leaders in these firms actually outsource cheaper jobs to the US. And this is part of trade deals that, have allowed our big ag firms into Europe in exchange for them getting access to clean tech markets and sending over work that, frankly, no European in a social democracy would do. They would have higher wages and benefits. This is part of the legacy and sort of the bitter legacy of neoliberal trade policies. How do we get to a better trade system in your view, particularly at a point where, whether it's because of Trump's trade war or whether it's because of the sort of innate regionalization that was already going to happen? China's announcing that it's going its own way. It's got its 2035 policy, wants to have more localized supply chains. Europe is calling for more intra-regional trade. Whether the U.S. can rebuild its industrial infrastructure well, who knows? But it does seem to be that we're moving to a tripolar world. So what does that look like to you? What are you worried about? What do you think the opportunities are?
So I think there's definitely going to be some of that as you describe it, and as you've written about. I think there's going to be more of it that has to do with fears of China, a kind of de-Sinification of the world economy, because countries realize that, my God, we are 98% reliant on China for this raw material or this supply, this kind of computer product. But my suspicion, Rana, is that there will be a lot of hot air politically about this, and you will see less of it when it comes to it. Look, what is really going on in Asia right now? They just signed the RCEP, big trade agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was signed minus America. The African Free Trade Deal was signed. In other words, countries are actually searching for more trade rather than less. And there's a very simple reason. They want growth. So there'll be a patina of this kind of local supply chains and then, stuff like that. But for the most part, what you're going to see is a real search for growth and a real search for, for a country like India, what is it, 3% of the world economy, it has to find a way to trade with the rest of the world if it wants to grow. I think the challenge is what it always has been with trade, which is Obama gave a very good speech about this once when I think it was the Korean trade deal. And he said, look, we all know what the answer here is. More trade benefits everyone. But the problem is you get real dislocations. And you have to be willing to spend real money to try and help people through those dislocations. But here's the dilemma, he said. We all say this and we never spend that money. And I think what has happened with trade is the accumulation of 30 years of that idea, which is you have kept accelerating the pace of the opening of trade. You've opened up in different areas like capital and services and things like that. But you have never put in place spending real money to cushion people from the blows, to allow them to retrain, and frankly, to give them more benefits. The example you gave, which is so interesting and telling about the green jobs in America. Well, what that tells you is you can go one of two ways. You can try to say, okay, we're going to close down the world. We're going to have, we're somehow going to protect ourselves, which, Trump has tried with China. It's been, I think that you have a 4-year record now. It hasn't worked. Manufacturing did not come back to the US. Or you can say to yourself, that is why the government has to provide universal health care, provide universal daycare for children so that, young women can go out and work, provide retraining almost as ubiquitous. I mean, I would like to see a kind of GI bill for retraining, where basically if you lose your job, the government will always pay, a community college will always train you, and a local industry will always identify the need for, and if you, now it's a simple system as the GI Bill was. The trick is this, it would be very expensive. I think we are talking about very substantial amounts of money, tens and tens of billions of dollars. And if you do that, then you can have free trade. Then you can say, okay, those jobs, better to get those new jobs that are coming out of green energy because, the wages might be slightly higher, but the benefits are now better. You have, and you're paying into a system that is providing for your family. I in the book, I make this contrast between, two income family in the US and in Denmark. And I point out that, if you make, you save a little on taxes in the US, but think about what you get in Denmark. You get universal health care, universal free education from kindergarten through PhD programs, amazing infrastructure, strong retraining programs, free public transport all over the country. It's not a bad deal. I think a lot of people would say, I'll pay, 5% more in taxes.
100%. And I mean, there already are programs in the US at a local level that one could take national that look like this. I'm fascinated, just to stay on education a little bit more, I'm very interested in how education is going to evolve across the board. Are we going to see a linking of liberal arts education and vocational education? Are you going to see machinists that are also reading the classics? I mean, it seems like we're going to have to move away from this rather siloed approach that we've had in the past, where you go to a 4-year college, if you're lucky, you go to a really great one, your parents pay for it, you've been rubber stamped. Maybe you go to one in the middle that's not so great, you end up in a lot of debt, or you have a kind of a community program that's maybe cheap, and is it good or not, who knows? Do you think that we're going to see a morphing of all of that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Look, you made a point early on, which I thought was so true, which is that we've gone through this kind of massive shift to digital, accelerating things that might have taken 10 or 15 years. The place that's most obvious is in health, where we will have. I point out in the book, you're going to have 1 billion telehealth visits this year in the United States. People thought that would happen 10 years from now. But the second one is education. I think you've gone through this massive experiment. And I know you have young kids, Rana, and so you know exactly what this is like. It is a mixed bag so far. Some of this Zoom education works, some doesn't. But I think it's going to be an incredible learning opportunity. And it will allow us to better address the question you were asking, which is essentially, can you unbundle education? And can you create a much more a la carte model where people can take a certain amount of education for a certain period of time, patch it together? Why does it have to be 4 years in one physical location all at once? Well, I think there are historical reasons of trial and error why some of this works. Young people are at a point in life when they are ready to go through this. They're ready to devote themselves. It's a transition to the working life. But as you said, maybe we need a much richer variety so that people, that's one model, and that works for maybe 80% of people even, but it doesn't work for everyone. And the final point which you raised, I think, is exactly right. Look, it's very clear. I have a whole chapter called Life is Digital about the digital revolution. It's absolutely clear that with artificial intelligence, we are entering a world where computers are going to do basic analytic tasks better than human beings. So then the question becomes, what should human beings be trained in? And I point out that doctors are finding that their greatest role is actually not the pure diagnosis. The computer is going to do the diagnosis better than the doctor. The computer is looking at millions and millions of cases in 1 second. The doctor, if he's or she is super smart, will remember a few thousand cases. But taking that diagnosis and then fashioning it for the patient, communicating it, making sure the patient adopts that new regimen and regime, talking through the psychological complications of what it means to do this, being the kind of life coach, those become the crucial skills of a doctor. So the doctor is using the technology as a kind of analytic backbone, but it becomes more like a guru. Now, those are skills that are soft skills. For that, maybe the doctors do need to read a few novels or read some sociology or psychology, but we don't train them like that yet. But we should, because in a weird way, the more the computers take over, the more we get to emphasize that what is unique about us is our human qualities, our uniquely human qualities.
I couldn't agree more. I actually chose a high school for my son recently that stresses things like empathy, psychological traits, as well as academics, because I think that is so important. That's going to be a big sea change, though, particularly in certain Western countries where there has been, as you point out in your book, kind of a meritocratic elite that, we speak in a kind of a very, authoritative way about factual things. And to quote David Goodhart, the heart and the hands have been devalued relative to the head. And that does feel like it's going to be a big culture shift, could potentially unlock a lot of productivity, because you might see a lot more women either coming into the workforce or being able to get higher levels of pay relative, since caring has been largely done by women.
I think not just in the West, Rana, I think in Asia as well. Think about East Asia with this hyper analytic, engineering based curriculum. And when you look at places like South Korea and Singapore, which are kind of the high end of that chain, what they're beginning to see is that there's a huge amount of value in the creative arts. There's a huge amount of value in soft skills. So right now they still have the old model where it's like the engineers who are doing some of the soft skills. But clearly the better model would be to actually train people in these soft skills.
Yeah, my engineering father still has no idea how to make a living, but that's not a story. Let me go. You have a lot of great history in your book, and you're always really terrific. All your books sort of taking deep historical lessons and applying them to today. So you talk about how countries of the world, when it comes out of a plague, when it goes through a plague, there are these profound shifts. There's chaos, but there's also resilience. Maybe anything that we haven't touched on in terms of big picture changes and historical lessons from how this has been in the past, in Roman times, during the Black Plague in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right, that what happens historically when you look at it, and it's not just plagues, because the experience, particularly in the Western world, of sheltering in place, of not being able to go out, it's almost like populations that went through World War II or World War I, where they had to kind of stay in one place. You couldn't mingle very much. Global trade and travel shut down. What you tend to do is you tend to find that people spend a lot of time thinking about the external supports we need. what government program do we need? What stimulus package do we need? What should public health authorities have done? But really what gets you through these are the internal supports. Do you have the internal strength and resilience and patience? Have you figured out what is really important to you in life? And are you at peace with that? Can you do without all the meetings and the and the day-to-day stuff? So I think that one of the things it should remind us is that we need in life external supports, but we also need internal supports. And those are very, those are age old. Those are the same things that people have had to do. And if you want to caricature this a little bit, in the West, there is a much greater tradition of, kind of the external stuff. How do you control your environment? And in the East, there's a little bit more of a sense of how do you come to terms with, how do you make peace with the world you live in. Ideally, you'd get a marriage of the two. Ideally, you have some ability to withstand the stuff internally and also to have a certain amount of control externally. But the hardest thing, I read a lot of the novels that came out of the Spanish influenza, and all of them had the quality you were alluding to, which is the sense of resilience, this hard one, that getting back to normal was a great achievement, and you appreciated just normal human interaction, normal life, which became this prized commodity that you had been deprived of. So I think we all have that experience probably a year from now, not yet, but a year from now, having gone through this, there will be, I think, in a strange way, we will come to appreciate actual human contact with all its messiness and physicality, as opposed to this what is still basically a very functional exchange that we all engage in over these various computer mechanisms.
Yeah, that's a really profound point. I hope that you're right about that. Well, for the last question, we've done the micro, so maybe we'll go to the macro. You spoke about regionalization versus globalization. You're pretty optimistic that we're not headed to a more fragmented world. There's going to be conflict, but globalization will continue. Given the new administration in the US, what are your hopes for a reset between America and the rest of the world? How might that go?
I'm very hopeful that Biden will represent a kind of restoration of America's role as a country that is engaged in the world, that has been one of the architects, if not the architect and sustainer of a kind of open rules-based system. But it's a new world out there, and you've written about this, probably better than almost anybody, Rana, which is these countries are rising. They're charting their own paths. They're finding their own ways. Some of it is new regional orders. Some of it is just obstreperous new powers like Turkey, which is just going to be much more difficult to kind of corral into some kind of American-led international order. So I think that the real challenge is that we are living in a post-American world in which there's a great deal of freelancing by a lot of very independent countries. There is the reality of the rise of China and what it does, and that presents challenges and opportunities. But we need to think in a different framework. We need to think not how can America restore order, how can America restore the global agenda. I think we need to be thinking about how do we, for the first time in human history, how do we create a world in which everybody gets to participate, a more democratic international system in which a lot of these powers are recognized, valued, and you try to find a messy but forward-moving way to solve global problems. Because if you don't do that, you're just going to have deadlock and paralysis. We've been trying with global trade, and it's not working because, India defects or Brazil defects. And so we've got to find a new mechanism that really both empowers some of these other major powers, but also, I wouldn't say forces, but encourages them to step up and try to help solve some of these common problems. I'm not absolutely confident it'll work, but I do know it's the only thing that will work, because you're not going to move from you're not going to return to the American dominated world. You're not going to move from an American dominated world to a Chinese dominated world. We're in a truly, open world. And, the opportunity is that for the first time in history, we try to create democracy, not just within nations, but among nations.
Well, all right. Well, on that note of cautious optimism, our time's up. It's been great to talk to you as always. A lot of these questions are going to be addressed in the next sessions, and I hope everybody will stay and continue to watch. And thanks so much for your time.
Always a pleasure, Rana.